Hello students, my name is Shreya and I've come up with a short analysis of December 2018 UGC NET English Literature examination paper, right? So a lot of my students felt that the paper was unexpected, and when I asked them to give me their insights about the paper and how they felt about it, they said it was very different from what it used to be, right? So my analysis also, when I first saw the paper, I felt it was very different but not difficult, right? So in this video what we are going to do, and there are always in all exams some questions that are going to be kind of the ones that you've never read about or the authors that you've never seen, right? But excluding those, today what we are going to do, we are going to look at 5 sections, the 5 important sections from which all the examination questions come from in this examination. So there's British literature, right? There's world literature, there is literary theory and criticism, there is English language teaching, and there is rhetorics and prosody. Where rhetorics is related to the figure of speech and prosody is related to the rhyme scheme, etc. in a poem, right? So these are the 5 important portions of the text. Now I don't think that it's important for you to delve into as to how many questions from British literature, how many were from world literature, because that doesn't really make sense, because it gives you no insight as to how many questions are going to come further, right? From literary theory and criticism, for example, in the last examination there were about 10-12 questions which dropped this time around. Or you could say the paper itself became more theoretical and in a fashion of more criticism like, right? So even if the direct questions from this portion were less, the entire trajectory of the paper was more critical, right? So you can't say this one was ignored or anything like that, right? So now let us look at each portion and let us look at some of the important questions from each of those portions, right? So the first one, right, British literature. Now some questions were direct. There were certain other sets of questions where poetry was the focus. So lines from poetry were quoted. Right? And a lot of these were romantic writers, romantic poets. So there was a question on Keats's all the odes and their beginning line. There was another question on Keats again about one of the lines of his poems. Then there was another question on Blake. And the line that was given to you was from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Right? For Keats's ode, it was all the odes on the Nightingale, then on the Grecian urn, autumn, melancholy, right? So all these odes were mentioned and you were asked the first line. So a lot of focus was on romantic poetry. Then I also remember another question that gave you Tennyson, gave you a poem of Tennyson's, I think Crossing the Bar, right? And it also gave you Walt Whitman's poem, which was the Death Carol, and asked you the emotion behind the poem, right? So the emotion behind the poem was asked, right? So focus on poetry is an important aspect that was seen in this paper this time around. Focus on poetry. What kind of poetry? A lot of romantic poetry. In terms of romantic poetry, what was asked? The lines were asked. And in terms of your other poetry, themes were also becoming a focus, right? And now for Keats's ode also, they asked you the first lines. And the first line had usually the most important words. Like for instance, for the Grecian urn is called, often he's referred to the Grecian urn as the unravished bride of silence. Right? Unravished bride of quietness. So that is there in the first line itself. So not like you need to go through the poem in detail and remember each line, but the important lines of now the poems become very important for you for the exam point of view. Right? As far as the direct questions are concerned, there was a question on Scottish Chaucers, and all of us know that Scottish are the people who are writing in the contemporary times of Chaucer and were from Scotland. So we've already done this in the history of English literature, the series of lectures that I'm delivering every day. So the list includes, I told you, Barber, it includes Robert Henryson, it includes William Dunbar, it includes King James I of Scotland, and we've also in that list done all the works itself, right? So like I said again, some direct questions, some questions that focused on poetry, right? That asked you to fill in the words, right? Again, becoming a very critical, again the question paper becoming very critical in its approach. So you're not just asked any random thing about any random author or his or her work. You're asked to look at the poem, to understand the poem, and through your understanding in that short span of time, fill in the words which you think are most appropriate. Then they also asked you meaning of certain words. Right? They asked you the meaning of certain words in a poem. Meaning of those words, and there was also, so the next Keats question that I was referring to, they asked you, art is beauty, beauty is truth, truth is beauty. What does that statement mean? Right? So this was also a question. Then there was also a question regarding poems only, which was, it mentioned Samuel Johnson's Vanity of Human Wishes. Right? And the question was as to which kind of satire does it represent. Right? The kind of satire. So we all know that there is juvenile satire, juvenile satire, or an Horatian satire. Right? Whereas Horatian satire is more mild and acceptable to an extent. It is more tolerable. Juvenile satire, on the other hand, is very harsh. It often tends to get personal. The tone is angry, right? So, for example, if you look at Swift, who's one of the greatest satirists of all time, Jonathan Swift, right? Jonathan Swift, Swift's Gulliver's Travel is Horatian satire because it's mild, it's acceptable, it's tolerable, there is a lot of humor that is involved. But his Modest Proposal is often said to be a juvenile satire, and so Vanity of Human Wishes is also a very angry satire by Samuel Johnson, right? So this was a direct question, but again, it's a poem that is being asked. But what is being asked? Like I told you about the Tennyson and Whitman question also. They're not asking you who's written this poem, which you usually used to be the question. They're not asking you to put these in order or anything like that. Which came first, which came second. The years are no longer important. What is important is what is the emotion behind the poem. What is the kind of literary technique that is used, right? So the focus shifts from years of publishing to theme of the poem, to literary techniques of the poem, right? Then there was also a question that talked to you about Cavalier poets, right? So there's also a focus on literary eras. What did it ask you? It asked you about to sort of figure out what the characteristics of all Cavalier poets are. So for here, for instance, they were not religiously involved, or their writing was not very religious. But what it makes you do for the future preparation is look at all eras and figure out characteristics. Right? So if you're looking at Victorian era, understand what are the traces of Victorian. So Victorian era, morality was given a lot of importance. So Victorian morality, as we hear it also. So morality was at the center, and then you figure out the other characteristics that existed. Similarly for Elizabethan era, similarly for Jacobean era. So for all these eras, you need to figure out the characteristics of the particular era as well now. Now, like I mentioned about direct questions, there was one on the Scottish poets, Scottish Chaucers. There was also a question on peasant poets, which we know are Robert Burns and John Clare. And similarly, there was a question of this category of poets. There was also a question in world literature, which I'm going to eventually discuss with you. So now this makes peasant poets, Scottish Chaucer. So this makes the Bloomsbury important. It makes the graveyard poets important. Who are the graveyard poets? Then who are the poets of pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood? Right, so all these groups of poets or writers become important because there are direct questions that are being asked about who are the authors who've come under this category, right? Then there were also question on characters and novel, which is the novel matching question, right? And they have tried to make it difficult for you. So even if you know that Miriam is a character in Sons and Lovers, so the question was from Lawrence and a lot of his texts were given. So the Rainbow, Women in Love, Sons and Lovers, etc. A lot of his texts were given and the female protagonist was asked. So, and it was not very easy to understand even if you know, because Sons and Lovers is usually in all our syllabuses. So we know Miriam is a character in Sons and Lovers, but it was still not easy for you to comprehend the other options, right? So it makes important authors and their important texts also important, because you must then know the basic outline of those texts as well, right? So these are some of the pointers from British literature. These are some of the questions that were covered from British literature. In the next video, we are going to look at the kind of questions that were asked from world literature. ELT, like I told you, literary criticism and theory. And the last one, rhetorics and prosody. Right? So this was the part 1 of your discussion of the question paper. I'm going to put up at least one more part, and if I feel the need, 2 more, where in the second one I'm going to tell you the other portions that you need to, the kind of questions that came from the other portions. And in the next one, what we are going to do is, I'll give you a brief layout of what I think about the paper and how should you proceed with your preparation from then on. Right? So if you think this was helpful, you must subscribe to the channel, and you leave any comments if you feel you need to, you require a video on any other topic. Thank you.